Great. Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Evan Pundyke. I am the marketing director at Arrive Logistics, and we have a fantastic presentation for you today. Before we dive in, I want to cover a few quick things on the functionality for Zoom, for those of you who don't know. There's a question and answer feature, and there is a chat feature. So if you're having technical issues, or if you have a question throughout the thing or the presentation that you would like to make sure we touch on, please send it my way, and I'll make sure we answer all of them at the end. Briefly, without making this too much about Arrive, I would like to just explain who we are for those of you who don't know. We are a freight brokerage. In the little over 3 years that we have been in business, we've gone from 10 employees to over 300. We're currently serving over 2,000 customers. In 2017, we've moved 100,000 loads, and what we really attribute to all this success is remaining customer focused and investing in our people, our technology, and what will give our customers the best customer experience. So with that said, I'd like to talk a little bit about our speaker today, Montague. Mark studied mathematics, earning a business degree from Viterbo University. He After understanding the challenges from the changing energy picture, Mark went back to school for an MBA from the IU Kelley School of Business and started his career in transportation that has spanned the last 4 decades. Along the way, Mark has worked on behalf of shippers, brokers, and carriers in both analytic and operational roles. More recently, in 2009, Mark joined the DAT, and has been instrumental in developing the Rate View tool, which many of you may know is the largest trucking rate database in the world. So with that said, I'm going to scoot over and give this to Mark, who's going to tell you a little bit about the DAT, which is where all the data is coming from today. Thank you.
One of the main things DAT is known for is freight matching. And such, it's kind of like a dating service for loads and brokers. We also have a rates database, which was measured early on this year at $33 billion. We do data analytics. We have demand measurements, capacity measurements, and rates. So it's really a set of tools that gives you visibility to the freight marketplace for both spot market as well as contract rates. So we're going to do an overview today of some of the recent shipping conditions, how we got to be where we are here late in the year, and what that really tells us about what we can look forward to in 2018 as far as the business conditions, how it's going to impact the market, and finally how to become a shipper of choice, which is going to be very important, as you're going to see with the rate predictions that we have. Now, why does this matter? You can't control the market, but you certainly can control the degree of impact to your supply chain. And we think that especially in this current period of time, the way that you're structured to interact with your shippers, or the shippers interact with the carriers, is really, this is one of the most important years for that. Now, one of the expectations, there's surveys that go out every year about this time, maybe starting out in August and through the end of the year, of what do you think rates will do in 2018? Well, there's a real disconnect this year in that shippers think that rates will raise somewhere between 2 to 4%. And that's based on the recent experiences of the past 2 or 3 years where rate increases have been relatively benign. In fact, there's been at least 1 year where rates actually decreased. Now, on the other hand, we've seen exceptional tightness in the freight marketplaces, starting really in September with the hurricanes. And carriers and brokers, based on those experiences, think that rates could jump up 7 to 10% or even more. And our prediction is that, yes, shippers with best practices that have kept open lines of communications and work closely with their carriers are going to have a more modest rate increase, perhaps in the 3 to 4% range. Shippers with positive attributes but issues in one or more areas we'll see a little bit higher rate increase of 5 to 6%, whereas shippers with poor practices will bear the brunt of the market pressure that's going to be coming from multiple facets of the transportation environment. And now we're going to jump into what some of those things are. First of all, everything's connected. The spot market really provides an early warning for contract rates. We've done research on that topic and found that the typical lag is 3 to 6 months from spot market trends leading into contract rate changes. As far as the size of the spot marketplace, we're actually talking about between 25 and 30% of all the truckload transactions in the country. So it's a significant amount of volume. And whereas it's not as large as the contract rate marketplace, we do believe that the spot market, for various reasons, has been gaining market share, at least in the recent period. The other things to watch for is that the refrigerated produce does impact spot market van pricing. When produce is not busy, reefers compete with vans. Flatbed activity similarly also competes with spot market van pricing. So once again, everything is connected. Now, our first graphic that we're looking at is something called a load-to-truck ratio. For you, those of you who may not be familiar with this statistic, it's a simple statistic derived from the freight load boards. It's the number of load posts in a given period of time divided by the number of truck posting in the same period of time. Now, those are not equal measures in that a broker is far more likely to post its load than the trucker is likely to post the truck. So we've actually found in the bottom orange line, equilibrium for vans is about 2.5 loads posted for every truck posted. If you look back on the graph at March of 16, it's in the circle, you see the load-to-truck ratio is 1.6. And you see a whole period of time early in 2016 where load-to-truck ratios were well below that 2.5 benchmark, which is generally typified by falling prices and loose capacity on the spot marketplace. In the months that followed, the load-to-truck ratio hovered between 2.5 and 3.0, which is pretty much around that equilibrium point. And then you started seeing December where the load-to-truck ratio intensified and dipped down to the first quarter and ended up with 3.1 in March of 17. Well, that's kind of an early warning signal once you're over 3.0. And the fact that that ratio is twice what it was in March, not only for van freight, but also for flatbed and reefer freight, is a good indicator of higher rates that are going to follow. And some months later, higher contract rates as well. Now let's skip ahead. Let's skip into August. And here I've actually chosen a period 2 years apart so that you can see stark contrast. This is called a hot market map, where the bright red areas indicate more demand, more pressure, difficulty in covering trucks. If you look at the legend, you can see the brightest red areas have a load-to-truck ratio in excess of 5.5. Whereas the map on the left is mostly pale, you see a lot more markets that are hot on the right side. And what we've in fact done is ignore state boundaries. We've created a map based on 135 market definitions, which is what we use in RateView for pricing. And these markets really give you a more detailed picture of what's going on around the country. Skipping into September, you can see that there's very few pale markets on the map. Most of the pale markets are in Texas. This is post Hurricane Harvey. This map is actually from September 7th of this year. And you can see the impact was pretty severe on southeast Texas along the Gulf Coast. And what happened was it immediately tightened up truck capacity throughout the remainder of the US. A couple of exceptions were Stockton, Sacramento, California area, and western Nebraska. Otherwise, pretty much hot areas throughout the United States. Skip ahead 3 months later and think, well, we've moved away from the hurricanes. If things calm down, December 7th, not much. In fact, what's happened is you can see that the entire west side of the country has now become challenged for freight capacity. There's a few zones, a few markets on the eastern side of the country that have become pale as a lot of trucks delivering from the West Coast have produced a little bit of capacity in those marketplaces. And as we move closer to Christmas holiday, that pattern's moved a little bit away from California and more to the middle of the country. But the whole takeaway is, yes, the hurricanes really caused intensification of tightness of truck capacity, but this was actually seen to be developing well before the hurricanes hit. Now, another thing we can look at is actual volumes that we see on the spot marketplace. And if you look at a month-by-month recap of the last 2 years, you can see that we entered 2016 in a pretty soft state. If you use April as kind of a normal month, April 2016, you can see that the freight volumes were subpar in the first 3 months of the year, and then they accelerated quite a bit from there, from May into the summer of 16, with a little bit of November dip. That's typical because you've got a couple of holidays. You've got Thanksgiving and the day after Thanksgiving in a short month. And then again, volumes were up in December. Then if you look at the orange bars, which are on the right side, you can see that once we moved away from the first quarter, freight volumes were well above that April of 2016 threshold, somewhere between 160 to almost 200% of that volume level, and that volumes are actually peaking at the end of 2017. So spot market freight volumes have been strong now for about 18 months, and there's no let up in sight. As far as what the spot market rates have done, and we'll show how this is how this ties in with contract rates. If you look back at where we were in 2016, the purple line, you'll see that the only recent line in the last 5 years that was lower was 2013. So we really had a relatively low rates for the spot market, with the lowest point being April of 2016. And the rates since that time, the red line, have moved away from those lows to first in May and June of this year to catch up to where they were in 2014 and 2015. Now, in early September, I looked at business conditions and projected out the gray line for the end of the year. And as you see, actually the second Hurricane Irma boosted that September number. But where we are right now, just about where we were projected using DAT's formulas for predicting rates from load to truck ratios. So here's our key takeaways. The data showed tighter capacity in March of 2017. This data indicate that we would see higher spot market rates. And then we know from the lag that contract rates would be expected to rise by the fall of 2017. Now, the one unforeseen factor was the impact of the hurricanes in accelerating the market and really taking it to a place that we really haven't seen before. And we've been tracking rates since 2008, 2010 period. As far as spot market rates, they're now up more than 20% year over year. Van and reefer are up 24% in November from 1 year earlier, and flatbed rates are up 21%. Now, those are not full year increases. If we translate that type of spot market pressure over several months into what's a likely contract rate increase, it's usually about 1/3. So 6 to 7% long-term contract rate increase from a sustained trend in the spot market would be a likely outcome. The next thing that we have to consider when you look at the increase in spot market freight and its resulting impact on contract rate is what about ELDs? We're right on top of the ELD mandate start date of December 18th. That's Monday. And we know that it's going to heavily impact the smaller end of the trucking spectrum. Now, nearly all of the large fleets are fully ELD compliant, but some small fleets have not yet installed ELDs. In fact, many owner-operators are resisting ELDs, and they're threatening to leave the industry. No doubt we will lose some capacity from drivers either retiring or quitting due to ELDs. And if you look at the statistics, 91% of the for-hire fleets in the United States operate 6 trucks or fewer, and 97% of for-hire truckload fleets have 20 power units or fewer. If you look at the sheer number of truck lines, there's a few hundred that operate hundreds of power units, say 500 or more. And then you rapidly go down to the smaller fleets, of which there are approximately 100, maybe call it 200,000 for-hire fleets in all. The second part of the ELD impact, we did a study internally at DAT. We looked at different lengths of hauls and how they would be impacted. For example, under 100 miles, 100 air miles, those drivers that pretty much stay in that range are exempt from the ELD requirement. Also, drivers running 1999 engines or older are exempt as well, as are agricultural haulers. But there's a couple of lengths of haul that are particularly susceptible to the ELD mandate. One is the longer one-day trips, say in a range of 500 to 650 miles. A certain percentage of the time, those drivers, because of some type of delay, either from traffic or loading or other unforeseen equipment problems, may have trouble completing the one-day trip. Now, if it goes into the second day, you may have trouble because of your delivery appointment. Also, you're incurring an extra day of overhead, which greatly inflates your costs and may make the trip unprofitable. So looking at the productivity thing, the number that I came up with, various scenarios, they all ran between 4 and 5%. So on average, 4.5% is a good number to think about for small carriers, what they need to overcome in 2018 just to stay where they were in 2017 from a business standpoint. Now, large carriers can overcome those productivity losses through trailer pools and operational changes. So if you're using a drop and hook type operation for your trailers, you minimize your impact at the loading dock as far as loading delays and unloading delays. Also, you can run relays and stuff like that. Well, that works very well for large carriers. Small carriers typically can't have the business space that support trailer pools, nor do they have the capital required to have, say, a 4-to-1 trailer to tractor ratio, which many of the large fleets have. As far as the number of fleets that have installed ELDs, the best we could come up with from various sources was about 75% of the fleets have installed ELDs. Now, what happens on December 18th when the ELD mandate starts? Well, actually, the fines will be in place, but the out-of-service penalties, where they actually shut down the trucker for 10 hours, those penalties will not start until April 1st. Also, the penalties against their CSA, that's their safety score, will not start till April 1st. So there's a couple of requirements that are postponed, but the fines do start at $250, determined on a state-by-state basis. They could be as high as $1,000 per occurrence. So when that trucker gets stopped by a DOT inspector, they better have an electronic logging device if they're required to have one. The second thing that also is related to the ELD requirement is the driver shortage. Now, I entered this industry in the early 1980s, and it wasn't too long I'd been in this industry, we started hearing about the looming driver shortage. So this is not a new topic. It's one that resurfaces every few years. But the facts are that the average driver age is 55 years old. And the fact that now the ELDs are coming, This means fewer miles, potentially less pay, and there's a higher likelihood of more drivers leaving the workforce. Also, we have low unemployment, which makes other careers possible. And what's undisputable is that fleets have been having a harder and harder time finding quality candidates. In fact, the turnover ratio has increased to 95% for the large fleets. It's 84% for smaller fleets. One of the top complaints of drivers is the uncompensated waiting time. So we know detention is going to be a issue, is going to be a focus point of carriers in 2018, particularly with the record of knowing which shippers have delays and being able to easily compile these this type of data from the ELDs into databases. So our shipper tip is to make sure you adopt practices that make you a shipper of choice. You want to increase your operational efficiency, and that'll give you better capacity and better rates. Another factor is to think about e-commerce. Now, e-commerce is growing at a 14% annual pace, which will double the market share of e-commerce in about 5 years. So if you go back 5 years, it was a single-digit thing, and already, say in 2012, 13, it was starting to make inroads and causing some brick and mortar stores to close. So you can just imagine where it'll be in 2022 when the market share doubles again. One thing about e-commerce is it disrupts the traditional supply chain. I can remember sitting down with shippers and them talking about their carrier requirements in the coming year and saying what kind of volumes they'd have on every lane and when the shipping season would be. And typically that peak would be September and October, and we get through that and it would be a pretty smooth sailing because the goods would be in the stores in early November for Black Friday. That's no longer the case, and that peak season tends to run from September all the way through the end of the year. And then now you've got stuff like Christmas in July, the midsummer promotions that can also cause spikes in spot market traffic. And yes, one of the things that we've seen is as e-commerce activity has picked up, it's caused a lot more short lead time type situations. It caused more varied things. The distribution centers to serve e-commerce are more varied, a lower volume, and there's a lot of focus on last mile deliveries that are very service sensitive. The upshot from the last mile is that the previous move now has more pressure on it. These are all things that put pressure on the spot market because that's where the flex for the marketplace is to find capacity. A lot of times contract operations depend on advanced planning, 48 hours or more to get trucks in the right position. Another thing to watch out is where is the price of oil. The benchmark I watch is the West Texas Intermediate oil price. One thing that we've learned when the price is above $45 a barrel, it seems like activity on drilling side as far as investments in the oil industry are pretty much on track to go forward and increase. This drives the industrial side of the economy and the trucking spot market. Flatbed freight is very sensitive to what's going on with the oil economy because of its movement of pipe, drilling equipment, and other commodities. It also spills over into the van marketplace, particularly with the byproducts of oil, plastic, polymers, resins, films, and those types of products. As far as 2018, the expectation for a variety of factors is the price will remain about $50 a barrel. And in fact, it could exceed $60 a barrel, with some analysts calling for oil as high as $75 a barrel. Now, this will drive freight rates in two ways. One, higher oil prices means higher fuel prices, which means pressure on carriers to not only ratchet up their fuel surcharge, but it's also in a rising oil price, it puts pressure because the carrier is buying fuel before they're getting paid for fuel. The second thing is that more freight will also drive the freight economy, and you can expect the pressure to build more refinery capacity, more pipeline, more drilling activity, and more supplies to support the industry will remain strong in 2018 as long as the price stays above 50, in many cases $45 a barrel. As far as economic growth, that's another important thing. Now in the second and third quarter of this year, GDP growth, gross domestic product has been greater than 3.1%. Now, as opposed to the early parts of this decade where the US was kind of alone with economic growth and the world was in some state of recession, the worldwide economy has joined the US economy. So worldwide demand has been steadily growing. That creates a backdrop of where we can not only grow our domestic industries, but we can also grow it through export. And in fact, if you look at the oil industry's capability to export, one of the recent things was a pipeline shutdown in Europe on the North Sea fields that will create a short-term spike in the energy prices here. So the worldwide demand is a very important factor. Also, the outlook for new orders and capital investments indicate that growth will continue well into 2018. And for now, inflation continues to be relatively low, while freight volumes show no sign of slowing down. So all the indicators for economic growth is that we're going to be in a strong position in 2018. And following the spot market data, you know, there's a little tiny dip this week. It's not worth thinking of it as a backward step, because I imagine with the December 18th ELD mandate, demand will ratchet up next week. We're going to finish December strong, and the first indicator of where we are might be mid-February. We might see a little bit of freight lull because that's usually the seasonal low point. But if that is a period where trucks are still tight in February, you've really got to ratchet up efforts to do everything you can to secure capacity for the balance of the year. So just to recap, we see overall economic growth as being above 2.5% in 2018, with good likelihood that we could be 3% in 1 or 2 quarters of next year. Oil prices are likely to stay above $50 per barrel. The disruptive impact of e-commerce will only continue and intensify. The regularly changed through ELDs, the full impact, just as the spring construction season gets busy, that full impact will hit on April 1st, and meanwhile the labor markets remain tight. So when you consider all those factors, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that trucking rates will be higher in 2018. The only question is, how high will those trucking rates be? So with that in mind, you have to understand some of the ways that those increases can be mitigated. First of all, there's a couple of terms to know about the industry. Relatively recent is driver coercion. Now that'll also apply to shippers and brokers as well as carriers, and particularly with the ELD mandate and that electronic log in every truck. When a driver runs out of hours and they've been waiting to get unloaded, you cannot force them off the property without a certain assumption of liability on the part of the shipper, because now you've dispatched a driver. So understand what driver coercion means. They do have something available if the trailer is empty or if they're bobtailing, that they can leave a facility on personal conveyance. One of the aspects of the hours of service is that after 8 hours on duty, the drivers are required to take a 30-minute break. They could take that 30-minute break anytime in that first 8 hours. They take it too early, say within the first 5 hours, then they have to take a second 30-minute break before their 14-hour clock runs out. So one of the things shippers can do is help drivers take that 30-minute break if they're waiting. Say if it's a shipper load and count load and it's a sealed trailer, you could have a break room, ensure that the drivers are not disrupted while on their 30-minute break. For example, they're not allowed to make a phone call to their dispatch. They're not allowed to answer questions about load, or it disrupts their 30-minute break and they've got to start all over again. Mitigate potential loading and unloading delays. I've been in the industry since 1981, and detention has been one of the top topics for trucking operations. It's not so much that, hey, you lose an hour, say if the loading takes 3 hours and you've got 2 hours free. It's not so much that as it just makes it impossible to complete a load in a certain day to reach a certain point that you need to reach in order to get to the load delivered on time. It can actually roll over a one-day trip into 2 days, a 2-day trip into 3 days. When that happens, it's a big increase in cost for the carrier. So that's why it's such a hot topic for carriers. I've actually worked with warehousing operations for about 25 years of my 4 decades. And I can tell you that there's all kinds of ways that you can speed up loading. And one of those is through packaging and shipping standards. For example, if product is not packaged properly, if it's loosely packaged, it can shift, it can fall apart. One of the things that you can do is review how freight fits in the truck and how educated are your dock personnel as far as their practices in those areas. Scheduling is another thing. A lot of times schedules are inconvenient for truckers. If they're precise times and there's penalties, that puts a lot of pressure on the truck to arrive early. I've been there where a shipper is demanded to know, or hey, your truck was supposed to deliver at this time, where is it? Well, it arrived at the gate, and between the gate and the dock, there was a delay, and there was no communication between the gate and the dock to let them know that their truck was there. So all these are simple things. There's probably more sophisticated things too. The most important thing of all is communications, and find every way you can to make operations smooth. So become a shipper of choice, and that'll really help. Just to recap everything, 1 year ago, we had early signs of spot rates rising, and that's something just about everybody can agree on now, is that, yeah, it does look like rates are gonna rise, and a lot of you have experienced shortages of equipment this fall. Higher fuel prices just add to that backdrop, and I think that's something that, fuel's up about 40 cents a gallon from where it was 1 year ago, and I think it should break the $3 a gallon threshold at some point in 2018. The van and flatbed freight was really healthy in 2017. So those of you thinking that, hey, this is just a one-time event from the hurricanes, we saw plenty of other signs with our spot market data that the freight environment is changing and transitioning. And as far as what's going to happen the last few weeks of the year and into January, that peak pricing with ELD implementation is unknown and unpredictable. One of the things in social media is that a lot of the owner-operators, they're really hauling heavy this week in an attempt to make as much money before the mandate goes in effect so that they can take the last 2 weeks of the year off. So we'll quickly see whether that has an impact with a lot of volume parcel deliveries for e-commerce moving at the end of the year. And of course, there's that whole backdrop. We know that the oil industry is in a multi-year expansion. Things like natural gas, there's still a lot more to be completed there for gas liquefaction plants. U.S. producers are looking at Europe as a prime market. So I think there's a whole lot of positive things on the economic side that have yet to happen. Now, so with that pressure, once again, we're going to recap the outlook for contract pricing. And that is if you've got the best practices, if you've got open communications with your carriers, if you've listened to them and adjusted lanes to better fit carriers. I think some cases you might hold it down to as low as 2.5%. So we're saying overall maybe 3 to 4% is a win in this freight marketplace. If you've got positive attributes but issues in one or more areas, probably see a larger rate increase in the 5 to 6% range. Those shippers with poor practices, it could be 7 to 10%, possibly higher. So that's reflecting, kind of the various voices in the marketplaces. That's really how I see this marketplace. It's building in some of the things that I've seen throughout my decades in transportation and looking at some of the most advanced rate information that exists anywhere from DAT Rate View. So just to do an overview, there's challenges shippers going to face. You really need to look at how do you feel about business conditions? Do you agree? With these market predictions, you do want to be a shipper of choice to reduce the impact. I want to thank Arrive Logistics for the opportunity to do this presentation with you today. Their folks have been fantastic to work with. Talk to Eric and Evan, both great guys. And at that, I'll want to take the question and answer portion of this presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you for going through that. You did a fantastic job. To everyone who's asking if these slides and video will be available, yes. So that's a great question to ask, and we will make sure you get all of them. So someone asks, since most large carriers have installed ELDs, does that already factor into the high load to truck ratios and rates?
Yes. I think that in August, we were probably at about 50% of tractors or 50% of fleets. And that, it's probably those numbers don't line up precisely, but we don't know exactly what the answer is. We transitioned from something like 50% to 75% by the beginning of December. So part of why load-to truck ratios are high, why trucks are tighter, is that a lot of trucks have moved from not using ELDs to using ELDs. Now we've got a little bit more to go, so that's why I think there's going to continue to be pressure in the remainder of December and January. That's why February is going to be an important point to stop and say, well, where are we now that just about everybody's adopted the LD?
Perfect. How do you see truckload rates and economic effects impacting LTL rates in 2018?
Well, one thing I'm well aware of is that there's a break point between LTL and truckload freight. And a lot of the sophisticated transportation management software that's out there calculates that break point. We could see a little bit more bleed over into LTL, just like we've seen bleed over to accelerate intermodal freight. There's in recent months, there's been a lot more intermodal freight on the rails. There's also been rising intermodal rates. So the same thing for less than truckload freight. Meanwhile, e-commerce is something that grows parcel and LTL. Now that said, one of the ways that LTL and parcel guys control their costs is they bundle that freight into volume moves and ship the freight in truckload mode as long as possible and just use the LTL and parcel for final mile. And one of those, that's one of the things that's growing this spot marketplace.
Beautiful. Do you have any more thoughts on how to be a destination of choice? So I think that would be expanding on kind of what you touched on, I guess.
Yeah, one of the things that we considered including, but may have been a little bit in the weeds for the general audience, was in-depth look at refrigerated produce. Now, when it comes to the refrigerated market, the contract is year-round commodities like ice cream, frozen foods, stuff that uses refrigerated capacity year-round. So that's your contract side. The spot market is more seasonal, of course, is driven by which produce is harvested at what time of the year. And if you go, what drives produce the most, it's the state of California, which is about 50% of produce. Now, so when you look at California, one of the things that depressed the market in 2015 and 16 was the California drought. So lo and behold, we have a La Nina winter, lots of snowpack and rain in California. In fact, it was too much rain this last year. So we were hoping for a big produce season, and it was kind of muted because, first of all the flooding and stuff made up for late planting season. And then came summertime, there was triple-digit heat, which reduced the harvest in the Central Valley. So then comes the fall season, on top of the hurricanes, some of the California produce started to finally show up. So some of the strongest numbers out of, say, the Salinas Valley and the Central Valley around Fresno were in September and October this year. And that's what happens with freight is you have one or two factors, okay, there's a little uptick or downtick. When you have multiple factors piling, that's when you get all these multiple things competing for trucks, and that's where you get a lot of rate pressure, and it shows up on the spot market. And then as those things are attractive to trucks over a period of time, it bleeds off capacity from the contract marketplace, and then you see contract rates go up.
Beautiful. If you're planning on doing an RFP in 2018, when would be the best time?
Before September. Probably the one window, if you can get into the year, and there might be a little opportunity, a window in February, because that's the low point. And it seems that whereas a lot of truck lines, a lot of shippers take the long view, there's always something that look at current conditions are somewhat influenced. So if we have some of that seasonal freight lulls where, hey, we're through the retail season, the full ELD mandate of April 1st hasn't stepped up yet. We got through some of the Texas and Florida rebuilding. There might be a little freight lull in February, and you might be able to convince some carriers to be a little bit kinder during that month.
Is there a way to set up relays with small carriers or owner operators?
There are probably some creative things that can be done. I managed a fleet with 15 drivers, 15 tractors, and we actually had about a 2-to-1 ratio of trailers to tractors. So we had a couple drop trailers in Ohio. We were Chicago based, and we were creative to work with that. And that goes back to that general advice of talk to your carriers, get to know your carriers, their strengths, what lanes they like to run. They may actually have some drivers domiciled outside their main base that they like to go to all the time, and they could be convinced to have some trailer assets there, which would facilitate, the rapid changeover. So the answer is, yeah, and you find that by getting to know small operations. I once worked with a large shipper on designing their North American logistics system. This was something that was really fast growing, and I found a good way. It depends a lot on large carriers. The old, hey, I'll pick 7, 8, 10 guys to do the bulk of my work, but there was actually a lot of roles for smaller carriers. And some shippers choose to work directly with small carriers. The other thing to do is find a trusted broker who has a deep stable of small carriers and knows how to work those interfaces to do the relief on those types of situations. So it kind of gives you that additional card to play.
Beautiful. This question is, how confident are you in the policing and enforcement of ELDs in the early stages of 2018?
There's really a mixed thing of that. I know John Seidel has some really deep and good insights into that, and I've talked to him directly, and I think there's going to be varying levels of enforcement throughout the United States. But that said, I'm confident that some states are going to be pretty gung-ho about enforcing that, which means, yes, it's going to be a thing, but at the same time, it's not going to be even. There may be some leeway, particularly these first couple of weeks with more warnings than tickets being written. But they're serious about this.
For sure. And for those of you who don't know who John Seidel is, he is a subject matter expert and on ELDs, and he's actually someone that Arrive has on retainer. So if you have a question on ELDs going forward, you can reach out to your rep, and your rep can get you on the phone with John, who can also answer any ELD related questions you have going forwards. So thanks. Are there particular regions that you see being more affected than others in 2018? And when do you see California dying down?
Oh, that's a great question. And one of the things that we've learned through our analysis of spot market freight is the second quarter is really a Southeast region story. I think freight rates in Texas, it's going to be more of a higher rates inbound than outbound. I think Houston market is one that we've seen tremendous growth of through the years, but I think there's still a need to send more construction type freight into the Houston market for the spring season. Miami will be softer than normal because they didn't get planting done. So that actually means rates from Atlanta in Charlotte and any other distribution centers serving Florida are likely to be higher in the spring. California looks like it could be really back strong because the pace of traffic through the ports there is strong. We're set up for a strong year agricultural wise. Things could be slightly less intense in the Midwest just because that's kind of the counter to the where things are strong. For example, when rates were getting stronger out of Houston, inbound to Houston was getting softer. That's why it's really important to not just understand rates from, say, the national picture that we advertise, but being able to get down a little bit into individual lanes and to understand the dynamics between the lanes. One of the recent trends we've seen is Denver market actually getting stronger. And Denver is one of those poster childs, along with Miami and parts of the East Coast, for backhaul marketplaces. But as e-commerce becomes more of a thing, Denver's a hub for that entire Rocky Mountain region of the United States. So a lot of freight gets delivered there via either intermodal or air freight and then outbound from Denver. And so consequently you see rates up 10, 15 cents a mile from that market. So great question.
If discussing, and I see there's still a lot of people signed in and listening, which is great. And we're getting a lot of great questions. I just want to reassure you, if any of you guys are running close to the end of your time, we keep all these questions. We will make sure we answer all these questions. And we'll make sure that all the attendees get a little question and answer fully filled out. So I appreciate that. But maybe we've got time for just a few more.
Okay.
If discussing multi-year rates with carriers, what would be a realistic escalator for 2019 if indices are not used?
One of the things I've done throughout my career is RFPs, generally on the side of answering them for shippers. A few times I've been in position of representing the shipper as a 3PL, as an agent for a shipper. One of the things that I did not like was the multi-year RFP. I think that rates need to be an ongoing conversation. If you do a multi-year RFP, I think you're kind of asking the carrier to take on an added layer of risk, which means an added layer of pricing should be in the response. So 2019 is really such a wild card right now. It depends on stuff like political factors and a lot of worldwide factors. There's a lot of hot spots in the world right now that are unstable, and that's why I really don't want to speculate it was hard enough to put together a prediction for 2018. But thank you for the question all the same.
Wow. How do you see the expanded Panama Canal influencing freight flows from the West Coast across the East Coast?
That's a great question. When the canal first opened up, people talked about the difficulty of taking the steamship schedules and completely redoing them to put more freight on the East Coast. And while it's popular to minimize the over the land transport in order to bring costs down, the added sailing times does decrease the responsiveness of supply chains. So that said, with the larger ships, we're going to see more and more freight landing on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. But we had a temporary reversal of that, and that's one of the things that really drove part of the freight trends. Was, first of all, you had the Port of Houston, which is the major ocean port on the Gulf, disrupted. And then as people were saying, well, we'll switch from Houston to Miami, no sooner was that decision made than the whole southern part of the Atlantic coast was disrupted from Irma. Miami, Jacksonville, Savannah, North Charleston, all the way up. And we saw really intense activity at ports like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, the New York, New Jersey ports, as a kind of an offset to the hurricanes. Also, the planners for ocean freight over in Asia had to then shift freight more into the West Coast. So we saw freight, first of all, you book all the capacity in the LA Long Beach, and then they shifted to Seattle. So we've seen rates, head haul rates out of Seattle like I've never seen before. I'm talking about rates well over $2 a mile from Seattle to Salt Lake City. So it gets into some of these nationwide impacts that a regional issue like a hurricane in Houston or Florida, it's going to disrupt the South Central and Southeast region, but it really changed the supply chain dynamics throughout the United States. Now going forward, yeah, you're going to have ship with more freight into the East Coast, but a lot of these East Coast ports are not really ready for these, the maximum size. I think they're at 50 foot, or they're not quite deep enough to take a fully loaded post-Panamax ship in. So you continue to see California Long Beach do well. And I think as the worldwide economy grows, I think the West Coast volumes will be positive, even while the East Coast volumes grow at a greater rate.
Perfect. Why don't we take one last one? What has the market impact been on the CSX restructure, so the overall rail to overall rail capacity?
Yeah, we've got the Hunterization question. Hunter Harrison being the CEO of CSX Rail. Rail is one of my sub-interests. He restructured operations, which caused a lot of disruption. And one of the things that we saw in the summer, June, July, August, was the eastern half of the country and our hot market map become bright red. And one of the questions I had back then is, hey, what is the CSX rail restructuring creating more truck freight? And the answer is yes. And what they basically did was they closed a lot of their hump yards, went to flat switching. They restructured train operations for longer trains. That caused a lot of delays. And in fact, the rail industry, just like everything else, is connected, and that did produce more truck traffic. So that was part of the story. Well, the answer now is that yes, CSX rail operations are running smoother, running better. I've seen the train speeds pick up. Well, the dwell time, that's the time spent cars just sitting in a yard or being switched. Those numbers have come back to more normal numbers. But now we're also seeing issues with some of the other eastern railroads. Perhaps they're trying to follow suit. Whatever rail and truck are tied, rail car operations continue to disappoint many that follow that industry. Yet intermodal has still been a good relief valve, and I think we'll just have to see how rail operations do in 2018 to see if that continues to have a bleed over effect on the truck market, I think it'll continue to be a small factor as far as keeping truck volumes up.
Great. Well, why don't we, I mean, how much, you want to keep going, or we?
Hey, if we've still got people paying attention, I'll do one more question. How's that?
Sure. Here is, as a food shipper, we perceive that we have a mix of customer destinations, some preferred in general by our carriers, some avoided in general by our carriers. Assuming limited ability to influence processes at our customer, do you have any thoughts regarding how to attract contracted capacity for the tougher lanes with longer unload times, sometimes at a difficult to service hours?
When I started in transportation in the early 80s, I was with a warehouse specialized in food shippers. So well aware of the names and the consignees and some of the delays. And there, I think if you talk to the buyers at those consignees, sometimes they can have influences. Same thing on our shipping end of things. I was in the traffic group, and we often have battles with the people that are on the dock loading trucks. So I think it's not quite right to say that you have no influence. There's always people that are friendly at any of these operations. And if you can cultivate them, if you have an open dialogue with the carriers, I think some of those issues can be mitigated. And particularly with the ELD mandate, the driver issues that carriers have, this needs to be communicated intensely throughout the supply chain and get the word out. And do it in a, hey, let's work together type of attitude. I think that'll provide some benefits.
Beautiful. All right, well, let's wrap it up. And just to remind everyone that we will answer any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer live. And we are very appreciative for everyone for tuning in, and we'll make sure that a copy of the slides and the video is available. And this was great. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.